American power. Two ripped through the twin towers of the World Trade Center.
Stay safe.
One after the other, the towers collapse. The extent of the casualties is still unclear. Then Washington, another plane crashes into a defense building in the Pentagon. Welcome to BBC World News. I'm Nick Gowing. Two symbols of America's enduring power have been attacked. Two hijacked planes crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, causing both buildings to collapse. And in Washington, a third plane crashed into defense headquarters at the Pentagon. New York's Mayor Rudy Giuliani said the death toll from the attack on the World Trade Center may not be known for at least a day, but will be more than any of us can bear. At least 50,000 people work in the center, and that's in that building alone. The two cities, Washington and New York City, have been plunged into chaos. Troops and the National Guard militia are trying to evacuate the whole of the lower part of Manhattan. There are no indications so far of who is behind the attacks. President Bush said those responsible will be hunted down and punished. Leaders from around the world have condemned the attacks. The European Union's Chris Patton has said the attacks are the worst on the United States since Pearl Harbor.
It came out of the clear blue sky on a mild fall morning in Manhattan. At first, no one knew what had happened. Could it have been an accident? Surely nobody would fly into the twin towers of the World Trade Center on purpose. But 8 minutes after those first pictures, the full startling reality of what was going on became clear. In slow motion, you can see a Boeing 767, a passenger plane, crashing into the South Tower. A BBC correspondent, Stephen Evans, was on the ground floor of the World Trade Center when it happened.
I was on the ground floor of the building, sitting in a chair, waiting for somebody to turn up, as you do. There was a huge bang. It felt to me like somebody dropped a skip full of rubbish, a great container full of rubbish from a very great height, at which point smoke appeared everywhere, as though a mist had suddenly settled on the building. We all streamed out, some people running, some people crying, nobody really screaming, across the road, and you look up and you can see the top of one of the towers, smoke billowing out from it.
It is hard to imagine what must have been going through the minds of people on the streets below.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
President Bush was visiting a school in Florida.
I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
But it wasn't over, not by a long way. Almost as soon as the president had finished speaking, another airliner crashed on or near the Pentagon, the headquarters of the American Defense Department, causing panic in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The White House was evacuated, and there was what looked like an attack on the State Department, which runs American foreign policy. Back in New York, firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above them was safe. But the nightmare went on and on. And it was all live on American television. First, one of the towers collapsed.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter
The emergency services had cleared an area around the towers, but they'd not yet succeeded in evacuating the building. The people still inside had seen the other tower go and waved in desperation, but it was too late. And then the World Trade Center, proud symbol that it was of the wealthiest city in the world, was no more. At that time of the morning, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center and thousands more in the Wall Street financial district around it. The emergency services have been doing what they can all day, but they are overwhelmed by demand in an atmosphere of terror. Every airliner in the air across America was ordered to land at the nearest airport. A plane crashed in Pittsburgh. As smoke blew across Capitol Hill, the heart of American democracy, it is clear that this is the biggest attack on America since Pearl Harbor.
Once again, we see terrorism. We see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
In a brief break in the day, firefighters could embrace each other, but it will be many hours before their work is done, and many years before the full story of what this day means is told. David Loyne, BBC News.
Well, it's now just over 6 hours since the horror began in New York City. Fergus Walsh now talks us through the sequence of events so far.
It began in Boston when two passenger aircraft were hijacked by terrorists. These were United Flight 175 and American Airlines Flight 11, both bound for Los Angeles. They were forced to fly to the World Trade Center in New York. A third plane was hijacked at Washington Dulles Airport. That was American Airlines Flight 77, again bound for Los Angeles. It was flown to the Pentagon in Washington. A fourth aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, from Newark to San Francisco, crashed southeast of Pittsburgh. Now, the World Trade Center in New York was the fourth tallest building complex in the world, 1,350 feet high. The Twin Towers dominated the skyline of Lower Manhattan. The first impact was just before 9 a.m. New York time, 2 p.m. here. The hijacked aircraft crashed into the 80th floor of the North Tower, each tower being 110 stories high. Now, 8 minutes later, a second plane crashed into the South Tower around the 65th floor. The World Trade Center is the largest commercial complex in the world. It's effectively a mini-city. 50,000 people work inside. It has 90,000 visitors every day. The casualties inside and on the ground are unknown. What we do know is that American and United Airlines say the 4 aircraft involved had a total of 266 passengers and crew on board. Now, within an hour, the Twin Towers had collapsed. Now, unlike most conventional skyscrapers, which have lots of interior columns to give strength to the building, the exterior walls of the World Trade Center bore most of the load, so the direct attacks were enough to weaken the buildings and lead to their collapse. Now, let's turn to Washington. Within 45 minutes of the attacks on the World Trade Center, another hijacked plane had crashed in a direct hit on the Pentagon. One side of the 5-sided building was completely destroyed. Just over 30 minutes later, a car bomb exploded outside the State Department. Again, there's no figure on casualties. American fighters are now patrolling the skies above New York, Washington, and other key locations to guard against further attacks. American military and government buildings across the world are on high alert. Other tall buildings in the US, such as the Sears Tower in Chicago, have been evacuated. America's day of horror is still unfolding.
Fergus Walsh. Well, reaction to the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City, then the Pentagon in Washington, have come from right around the world. Here's Geeta Gurumurthy.
Soon after the first explosions in New York, President Bush spoke of his shock and horror at the unfolding tragedy.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Worldwide, there was a sense of growing disbelief as thoughts turned to who was to blame. A Palestinian group, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, denied initial reports that it was responsible.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
But some in the Middle East were celebrating in the streets, here at Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. But the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, expressed his sympathies.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
The spiritual leader of Hamas said they didn't support the attacks, but they were the effects of America's policies of oppression.
America is reaping what it sows in oppression and implanting vengeance in the hearts of those who've been wronged by the oppression and corruption. However, in principle, we do not support attacks against civilians or innocents.
But across Europe, leaders like the British Prime Minister sent this warning to those responsible.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
Across the globe, governments are now tightening their security, fearful in the wake of such terror and carnage. Geeta Gurumurthy, BBC News.
Well, news is coming in that President George W. Bush has just landed in Nebraska at Offutt Air Force Base. This is according to a pool report which has been filed by the agency reporters travelling with him. Earlier, at the beginning of the day, when the news came through of the incident and the hitting of the World Trade Center by that single plane in New York City, he'd been in Sarasota in Florida. Then he flew north to Louisiana, where he gave these remarks while he was en route for Nebraska.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President Bush will, amid the chaos and the shock in New York City, in Washington, and well beyond, right across the United States, the FBI and its international partners are already trying to work out who could be capable of planning attacks on this scale. Very few groups are thought to have the capability needed, and the Saudi rebel Osama bin Laden is one. He's currently in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban claimed today he was not capable of an attack of this size. But according to Islamic Jihad, the attacks are a consequence of United States policy in the Middle East. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins.
In the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, they're celebrating the massacre and mayhem in the United States. What's a disaster to much of the world is seen as a triumph by some. It's evidence of how much hatred has already been refueled by this disaster. Now American intelligence, which missed stopping the attacks, will desperately be searching for the culprits. And to find who's behind it, they'll first ask, how was it done?
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
Number one suspect has got to be this man, Osama bin Laden, the richest and possibly the most ruthless terrorist in the world. Bin Laden has declared the destruction of the United States his top priority. He heads and pays for an extraordinary international network of Islamic militants. Whatever the response, Osama bin Laden is already accused by the United States of bombing 2 of its embassies in Africa in 1998. 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans. It's only 3 months now since 4 Islamic extremists were convicted of those bombings by a court sitting in New York. Osama bin Laden was named by American federal prosecutors as the mastermind of these killings and a string of other attacks. Bin Laden is also suspected of involvement in this previous attack on today's major target, the World Trade Center. This bombing in 1993 killed 6 people and blew a 60-foot hole through 4 basement levels of the building. And this evening, many Palestinian and other Islamic militant organizations are distancing themselves from today's attacks. Perhaps they're fearful of American retaliation. A leading Middle East analyst in Britain hopes the blame won't fall on the entire Arab world.
It will stigmatize many innocent people, law-abiding people who have settled in the West. But what can states do? You've got to be practical.
Before today, the worst terrorist attack inside the United States was the Oklahoma bombing of 1995. And it was an American, Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted and executed for that mass killing. But tonight, nobody seriously believes Americans have been killing their own. And the mastermind for these latest attacks is being sought outside America's borders. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, government still has to be run in the United States. President Bush is now at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, where he's flown to from Louisiana and earlier Florida. Let's now go live to Washington, D.C., to Rob Watson. Rob, I gather that the president is going to convene a meeting of the National Security Council by teleconference from Nebraska.
That's certainly the plan. I think it's very significant that George W. Bush has moved to Nebraska, the home, as you were saying, of the U.S. Strategic Air Command. I think it underlines the urgency and the devastating nature of the attack and how seriously the U.S. government is taking it. I think there's probably also an element that the Bush administration was worried that perhaps if they all reconvened here in Washington, D.C., given what's happened, that they may be the targets of another round of attacks, certainly taking plenty of precautions.
Now, on the right of our screen and over your left shoulder, we can still see the rubble burning from what's left of that part of the Pentagon. Can you update us on what we know, particularly about Defense Secretary Rumsfeld?
Well, I can certainly update you a little on what's happening at the Pentagon. As you say rightly, there's still a plume of smoke just over my shoulder 4 or 5 hours after the plane hit the building. Now, what we do know is that there has been, as you can imagine, considerable structural damage to the building. They've had intense fires there. There have been casualties and fatalities. The Pentagon won't say how many. But there have been a large number of emergency vehicles on the scene, and a state of emergency has been declared here in the nation's capital to deal with the attack on the Pentagon.
Now, when we spoke a couple of hours ago, literally the whole of Washington was seized by shock. Nothing was moving virtually. What is the situation now, late in the afternoon?
Well, you're absolutely right. The whole city was just paralyzed because what had happened was that thousands, literally thousands of federal workers were told to evacuate the buildings where they worked in very, very short order. They came running out. There was then mayhem as they filled the streets, trying to figure out a way to go home. Now, many of them have now left. The government buildings are empty, and of course the streets are eerily empty, signifying a symbol, really, that the fact that this city at the heart of the government of the United States has come to a standstill.
Now, was there a bomb outside the State Department? There seems to be some confusion.
Well, I haven't seen that confirmed yet. I know for a fact that I was out looking at the smoke coming from the Pentagon. I was standing just near Congress, and I heard an almighty explosion. I couldn't quite tell from what direction it was coming from. A few minutes later, I bumped into an FBI agent and asked him if he knew what it was, but he couldn't confirm that there had been another explosion. I certainly heard an explosion, but whether it was coming from the fires at the Pentagon or from outside the State Department, I couldn't say for sure.
Now, Rob, we started talking about George Bush in Nebraska, running the government from there. What does this mean now for the machinery of government in the buildings, many of which we can see behind you?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the machinery has come to a stop, because apart from the essential functions of government that President Bush will no doubt be carrying out from Strategic Air Command, the government here is now an empty shell. All the federal workers have gone. Buildings have been evacuated, because I don't think there's any doubt that the authorities are worried that there could be more attacks. So they don't want federal employees inside the building. So all the normal functioning of government, the little tasks, the big tasks, as far as one can make out, they've stopped.
Rob Watson, thanks for joining us from the centre of Washington, D.C. Well, joining me also here in the studio is Dan Plesh, who's a senior security analyst currently with the Royal United Services Institute. Now, you were actually living in Washington until a very short time ago. Your specialty was the issue of security and defence. What's your assessment of whether ever America could have seen this coming?
Well, it's a grim evening, Nick, and the tragedy is that this sort of scenario has been run out at countless security conferences over recent years. The question
was it taken seriously?
That's the trouble. This and other threats of this nature aren't taken seriously. The drive is on things like Star Wars, which, again, people have said Star Wars has nothing to do with this sort of threat. And frankly, as one travels around America, one can see all too well that Americans in their airports don't take security as seriously as we do in this country.
Are you literally saying that on the checklist of threats, everyone became consumed, including the new Bush administration, by the issue of missile defense and rogue states, as opposed to this very low-cost, extraordinarily successful way of hitting America?
I think that's true to a degree. Obviously, there are many good people working against terrorism in America, but if you go to American conferences, even the NATO summit, I saw many security lapses there which would make people's hair stand on end, because there isn't the culture, such as, for example, was built up in Israel or in Britain in response to the IRA, to deal with and look ahead at these sorts of threats. America is just too open.
Isn't it about also the politicians and the security analysts within government, the National Security Council, CIA, actually recognising that you've got to have the whole spectrum of possibilities examined?
Yes, exactly. There's an analogy. When the Americans went into the Gulf, their Navy had no minesweepers, and they started blowing up on mines because minesweepers are little boats that don't get captains turned into admirals and don't have much of a macho image. And in the same way, soft security prevention is a very low-order, low-prestige occupation, and that has to change.
But you had a lot of contacts inside the security apparatus, the Pentagon, the National Security Agency, the National Security Council, and so on. Would you, and I put this idea to you, would you say there was almost complacency that it couldn't happen in America?
I think complacency is too tough. If you haven't ever really had it, it's hard to adjust for it. And this looks like being the greatest casualties in America since the Civil War, not just Pearl Harbor.
Let's look at the images from New York City, just a reminder of really what is almost like a moonscape now after an atomic bomb has hit. Would you say that really, and again I have to press the point, would you say there was almost a culture in America where no one could entertain even the possibility that something on this scale could begin to happen? And I think we can see there one of the wheels of one of the aircraft.
I think in theory people talked about it, but in practice, if it hasn't happened to you, it's very hard to take it seriously.
What about the issue of response? We've heard George Bush, first in Florida, then in Louisiana, and now from Nebraska, making very clear we will retaliate.
Well, Nick, I was on the bus here. I was with some American flight attendants who flew out of Boston, and I talked to them, and their immediate reaction was, I hope our dumb-ass president doesn't make things worse.
Why do you say that? Why are you quoting that?
Because I think it's easy from the outside to look at this and wonder what Americans might do, but I think there are many Americans who would like to see their policy pursued differently. This is not to give any room for the vile people who have carried out these acts, but it is to say that many people think that even when something like this has happened, one needs to respond intelligently and thoughtfully.
Now, you used the word intelligently and thoughtfully. Of course, a couple of years ago, America did respond to Osama bin Laden after the Nairobi and Dar es Salaam bombs. Would you say that that response by taking out a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum was the correct response, or is it your analysis, having lived in Washington for, 15 years, that really that was done for public opinion as opposed for effect?
We've all seen the film, or many people have seen the film Wag the Dog. I think that was a time when President Clinton was under threat at home with impeachment, and many people saw that as an instant reaction that shut up criticism of his being weak on terrorism. And of course, if one doesn't act, there are always people in the wings, in the Republican Party, screaming for blood, applying the political pressure to any politician to carry out a reckless retaliation.
Do you think, though, that many of the officials, some of whom are permanent government employees, will be far more cautious this time about saying we can find an electronic, chemical, or whatever trail, whoever they decide to identify?
I hope so. I think these are grim times for people in America, and one doesn't want to second-guess people who have been through such a dreadful experience.
Well, Dan Plesh, thanks very much indeed for joining us as we're watching there the most horrendous images. It almost looks like an earthquake, a combination of an earthquake, an atomic bomb. One wonders what else one can use, and one has run out of adjectives and adverbs to describe the horror of what has happened in the eastern seaboard of America in the last 7 hours. It all began at 10 to 9 local time during the morning commute around the World Trade Center when one of 2 hijacked aircraft flew directly into the World Trade Center. Then a second one did exactly the same thing into another tower within 90 minutes. Both of the enormous towers, where 50,000 people in total would have worked at one point during the day, both those towers had collapsed. And these are the images we are seeing now from downtown Manhattan of what is left now in that enormous area, the financial economic center, the heart of Wall Street. And this is now all that's left after an organization decided not just to do this in New York City, but in Washington, and also with another plane which crashed in Pennsylvania. We now have a special program presented by David Dimbleby.
This is the face of warfare in the 21st century. The events today in New York and Washington were so horrifying, it's hard to find the words to describe them.